¿Qué habéis cambiado? Empezamos.
John.
Buenas, bienvenidos a este vídeo de unplandivino.net. Vamos a ver, ¿por qué no resistimos a Dios? ¿Qué está pasando aquí, en el planeta? Que nos lo tienen que explicar y al final es muy simple, parece. Vamos a ver este vídeo de Miller con Claudia y con Ana Pilar de Argentina. Por orden alfabético, Ana Pilar, ¿qué tal?
Hola, muy buenos días. Muy bien. Hermoso día hoy por la Patagonia.
Anda. Ya viene la primavera, poco a poco, ¿no? Aquí el otoño.
Gracias.
¿Y Claudia?
Acá, Iván, sí, hoy ya no voy a decir el muy bien, en realidad, sí, llorando, pero sí, celebro, me río de eso.
Ya por lo menos sensibles, cada vez más sensibles a la ley de la atracción en tanto que ley y cosas así.
Sí.
Ya la compensación de estas leches que hemos visto tanto. Bueno, vamos allá y luego ya vemos si en un vídeo separado o después, pues hacemos una cosa que pensamos, aparte de comentar lo que aquí nos surja. Ya sabéis, pues si tenéis que apuntar algo para decir aquí hay que comentar algo sí o sí, pues paramos. A lo mejor yo lo paro también si me sale algo súper de que quiero comentarlo, preguntarlo, y luego intentamos eso, interrumpir todo lo que sea, pero no para hablar, sino para ver, a ver, ahí tenemos que preguntar eso. Es para, así lo vemos seguido y luego ya, bueno, vamos, que está muy bien este. A ver si lo oís bien.
Well, today I will talk mostly, it'll basically be a question and answer session today. But what I wanted to do today with you...
¿Se escucha?
Sí, se escucha bien.
Venga, vamos allá.
Is just raise an issue that I feel comes up from yesterday's discussion first, and then we can perhaps have some question and answers about it. So you've got the mic again, have you, Alex? Yeah. So for those of you, when you share, if you could just wait for the mic. Yesterday, the discussion we had yesterday was the relationship with God, the eternal benefits discussion. And I don't know about you, but I found many of you in the audience quite resistive to the discussion about God. And what I wanted to do today was talk to you about why mankind is so resistive to discussions about God. Just and we can have a bit of a discussion about that particular problem. Can I perhaps firstly give you a bit of history about mankind's existence and why this resistance towards God began, and then what happened with regard to the development of religions that caused mankind to have such negative viewpoint of God. When God created the first human couple, and obviously when I say created them, he created the bodies in which they existed. So he created the first couple's bodies. So both of the bodies, the spirit physical body and the spirit bodies, were created by God directly. And then the soul, of course, was already created by God, and the soul, the first human couple, incarnated. They don't have, when you talk to them, they don't have a memory of being young, like babies. They just incarnated and began their experience in an adult-looking body. And as a result of that, they don't really have the same experience that many of us have had, in the sense that we were born and we slowly absorb things through our environment. They still absorb things through their environment, but they weren't born in the same manner that we were born. However, those first human pair decided, before they even had children of their own, that they didn't want to have a relationship with God. Well, and to be accurate, it's not probably what they decided. What they decided to, in an accurate statement of what they decided that they wanted to be the same as God. So they wanted to have an elevated condition that was exactly the same as God's condition, without having to do anything for it. They felt that they had enough intelligence, that they had enough knowledge that God had given them through a process over years, that God had been spending time with them, and that eventually they felt that they should be able to be God themselves, and that they didn't need God making rules for them. They didn't need God to determine things for them. And so what they did is they chose, you could say they chose rebellion and self-reliance.
Aquí eso, la palabra es la misma, pero la traduzco de dos maneras diferentes para variarla un poco: autosuficiencia y autodependencia. Dependencia, la famosa self-reliance. Sigamos.
And in this process of choosing rebellion and self-reliance, they ended up in this state where they couldn't connect to God anymore because they'd chosen to reject God. And in this state of rebellion and self-reliance, they began immediately to degrade in their condition of love. So they started to degrade and go in a negative direction when it came to their condition of love, because to make that decision, they didn't understand enough about love already to even make that decision. So God allowed them, of course, to go ahead with that rebellion and that self-reliance. God allows us to do anything we choose with our will. Joy?
AJ, when they
Just wait for the mic to come up. Yep, fine.
when they appeared, what condition were they in to start with?
Well, you would classify it as a 6-sphere condition now. So they were perfect. They were perfectly made, and their soul was free of all emotional injuries. So they didn't make this choice out of an emotional injury. They made the choice based on a desire rather than an emotional injury. Does that make sense? So that also indicates that a 6-sphere individual, a person who's in the 6th sphere, can make a choice out of harmony with love. So it's not impossible to make a choice out of harmony with love, even when you've become perfected. And that's something that most people don't understand, but you can use your will in any direction. So you can always choose to use your will in a different direction than you've used it 10 minutes ago. And if you think about the course of an average day, for most of us, we use our will sometimes positively or lovingly, and other times very negatively, even in the course of one day. You know, sometimes we're in a rageful place or angry with someone or wanting to hurt somebody, and then we go into this feeling of sorrow about that and repentance about that and feel sad that we've done that, and then something else comes up, and before we know it, we're back into another angry place or something like that, and where we're wanting to hurt somebody or yell at somebody or so forth. And in the course of an average day, even the feelings in us do that. Even if we don't verbalize those feelings, oftentimes we have those feelings. It's a little different here, though, of course, because they don't have the injuries, or they didn't have the injuries. The original couple didn't have the emotional injuries that would have dictated to them to do these kind of things. They made an active choice. It was a choice to be God, basically. In that process, they went into rebellion and self-reliance. They no longer wanted to hear from God about love, and they no longer wanted to learn about love from God. And as a result of that, they had to rely on their own interpretations. And as they then had children after that point, they then imposed exactly the same emotional injuries upon their children, and their children very rapidly degraded in condition as a result of their walking away from God. Now, what happened there, though, is that there was this idea of rebellion. So that if we look at the emotional injuries that are on the planet right now with regard to God, the number one emotional injury is rebellion. We don't like law. We don't like God telling us what God's laws are. We want to go through the process of discovering it all ourselves. You look, even at a little tiny child has this emotion most of the time. If you think back to when you were bringing up your children, by the time the child is 2 years of age, and they go through the terrible twos, as the saying goes. The terrible twos are often this spirit of rebellion already being imposed upon its environment that is already present within the child, because it's an emotional injury we've carried down for millennia. Thousands of years. The second emotional injury that got established there and then was also this emotional injury of self-reliance. In other words, feeling that the only person that I can rely on is myself. I can't really rely on a partner because they might leave me, they might cheat on me, they might do something like that, so I can't rely on a partner. I can't rely on my friends because sometimes my friends have different agendas than what I have, and so therefore I can't really rely on them. And in the end, most people finish up having a feeling inside of them that the only person they can really rely on is themselves. Now, then what happened was that obviously Amón and Amán, the first human couple, started having children. So they, through their union, they had children. So let's just draw some of their children, and grandchildren, obviously, they had as well. Now, during this phase of children, some of these children passed into the spirit world. Now, in the early times of our existence, it took many hundreds of years for a person to pass. And sometimes there have been records in early history where some people lived almost 1,000 years in terms of time on the earth. But that very, very rapidly also degraded because of the degradation of the soul condition. And very rapidly we went down to 100 years of life on the earth. And then even after that, it became even worse. And eventually it went down, the longevity of the average person was around 20 years at some points in human history. So the soul condition had been so degraded by this stage that the average person could only live 20 to 30 years before dying from old age. So that shows you how negative the planet was in that state. These people passed over into the spirit world, and because the general population of the earth at the time was more open to spirit interference, these people began imposing their feelings upon the planet as well. So this caused a rapid degradation on the planet. And as a result of that, many people on earth started believing that these people were God, and these people were in a rage with mankind. They were manipulative, controlling, punishing. They were constantly trying to make things hard for people on the earth. They wanted all of their addictions met, and they tried to connect to people on earth who would allow the connection, and they try to influence people in a very negative direction. As a result, there grew a lot of concepts about God, that God is wrathful, and in fact, the concept about God that grew then was that God was in a rage with mankind, was the concept. And because these spirits acted out in rageful manners towards the people that were on earth, this concept was reinforced through the belief system. So fourthly, what would happen is that because these people were now in a state where they were actively working against God's loving laws, there was a higher and more powerful law of attraction in a negative direction. And what that meant was that the law of attraction now was bringing them to them individually events which made these people feel like they were being harmed by the law of attraction itself. Therefore being harmed by God. And so what most people started believing was that God wanted to hurt them and that God had to be appeased. God had to be, worshipped and also, appeased in some way. And this is where a lot of the belief systems that, you had, eventually they started sacrificing their own children to God in order to appease God, to make God's wrath go away, for example. And so there was this whole idea that God was going to punish them. And the only way that God wouldn't punish them would be that you had to appease God. You had to make God feel good, and then God wouldn't harm you. It was the whole concept. And so eventually, what they started doing is sacrificing their own children. Sacrificing of animals was very common. The whole concept grew that your very first fruits that you received off of any tree or bush or crop all had to be given to God. So you had to burn it or destroy it so that it would appease God. And then, of course, the earth went through cycles as well, cycles of change, major cataclysmic change, similar to what I feel is coming soon upon the earth as well. And these cycles of cataclysmic change also caused these people to believe that that was God's punishment of people on the planet as well. So this started to reinforce these beliefs. And so what they started to feel was that the events that their soul was attracting, instead of seeing it as a direct result of their own unloving behaviour, they started seeing it as God punishing them, and God started looking more and more to them like a cruel God. Someone who wanted to make their life difficult from the moment they were born, basically. Now, because many people still had a feeling that God existed, they then had to create religious structures that enabled them to safely believe these things about God. And so what they did was they started creating religious structures where they started to feel like God could be justified, and they started actually creating religions surrounding these belief systems that God was like this. And so all through human history and the so-called Christian viewpoint of God, or the so-called Muslim viewpoint of God, or the Hindu viewpoint of God now, many of these viewpoints have been around far longer than those particular religions have ever been established. For literally hundreds of thousands of years, these viewpoints have been around on the planet. And as a result, the viewpoint of God has been just imposed upon the planet over and over and over and over and over again. On top of that, for most people, they have a lot of emotional injuries towards their parents, right? So if you think about the average person, you've got different emotions that you have towards your dad and different emotions you had towards your mum. And when you look back at your childhood, you can see how your dad treated you and how your mum treated you. Now, if your dad treated you violently, then you would start to also accept that God was going to treat you violently, the masculine part of God. If mum was aloof, then you feel that the feminine part of God was aloof. And you start imposing the emotional belief systems that you've gained in your environment upon God as well. So now, besides having all of these issues with God, about God's nature and all of those kind of things, now we're adding to that a whole group of emotions, which I would call gender-based emotional beliefs. Now, when I do a presentation about God, it is the most difficult presentations. They are, for me, still the most difficult presentations to give. Mostly because all of these particular belief systems are in the soul of almost every person on this planet, even if they intellectually believe they don't have those belief systems. And as a result of that, any discussion about God or relationship with God is generally very difficult to conduct with a group of people. And if you think about all of those injuries, what I'm basically saying is that the person we have the most injuries with is God. Right? And then add to that, you've got some crazy nutter who calls himself Jesus talking about this God. Then you've got a whole additional set of injuries to work your way through with regard to that person as well. And so it becomes very, very difficult to actually be open in a discussion about God. In addition, if you examine it, the average person I interact with is either male or female. Is that not right? So if you're talking on a one-on-one interaction, we're either interacting with another male or a female, in my case. So, and in your case, it's exactly the same. You're either interacting with a man or a woman. So when you're interacting with a man or a woman, you've at least can dismiss half of the injuries. You understand? Because half of the injuries are probably with the male, and if you're interacting with a woman, then you don't have to worry about those particular injuries when you're interacting with that person. You're only going to be involved in the injuries that involve you with the female if you're interacting with the female. So immediately, with our interactions on the planet, even if no addictions are involved, we've already got half the amount of injuries than we've got with God. Right? Because God is both masculine and feminine. It's a sum total of all of our injuries to both genders that we're dealing with when we're dealing with God. So what we find then is that even in our interaction with individuals, we are far more open than we would be if we were interacting with God. In addition to that, we're often involved in addictive relationships with individuals. So we're often attracted to a person because of what they give us, because of, we have a nice feeling when we talk to that person, and we don't have a very nice feeling when we talk to that person. So which person are we going to talk to the most? The person who we have a nice feeling with, right? And if that happens to be some kind of addiction that it causes us to be in that attraction and not just a pure state of love that the person is in, then straight away I'm going to feel even more attracted to discussing something with that individual and more open to what they're saying as a result than I would be talking to someone who I'm not very attracted to. Now, if you think about that with God, God does not meet addictions. Remember I said that yesterday. So God doesn't meet any addictions. So any time that we're attracted to an individual because of the addictions they meet in us that causes us to feel an attraction to them, we can't have that relationship with God either. So then there's another set. God does not meet my addictions. Because remember, God wants you to grow. And if you are meeting your addictions, you're not going to grow very rapidly. You're going to be stagnant in your growth. So can you see, like, a relationship with God now has all of these impediments involved in it in comparison to a relationship with an individual. And so what people started to do on earth was they started to feel like it was totally impossible to have a relationship with God at all. Right? And what they did instead is they started making certain people who they believed were holy into gods. while those persons lived on earth. Does that make sense? So persons like Buddha, for example, were made into a god because Buddha was a person who, you know, seemed to be outwardly spiritual to the majority of people who surrounded him at the time, and seemed to have this connection with God that nobody else seemed to have. And in fact, Buddha himself didn't actually believe in a personal God anyway, which was also very handy for most of the people who were around him at the time. So, and he believed that God was more like an energy system, like the universe itself. And as a result of that, many people came to accept his belief systems. And because his belief systems were more loving than the average belief systems on the planet, they believed that Buddha himself was in a more loving place, which he was. And therefore, they started to follow the man and started to appoint him as God, in place of God. And they also did the same with myself in the 1st century, because I was at one with God and displayed the characteristics or nature of God in a pure place when I was at one with God. And they then started to treat me as if I was saying that I was God, which I always denied. And in fact, there are many records in the Bible itself that I've denied it, but they still want to believe that I'm God. And the main reason why they want to believe that is because they want to have a human they can relate to as if they're God, because we're so blocked to God. So we want to have somebody who we can see, feel, touch, and work out, oh, that's what God must be like. Mary, you want to ask?
Just from what you're saying, it seems like I understand why people want to deitize or make into God a person, because they feel so blocked to God for those reasons. But doesn't that also indicate that within each of us there is an inbuilt yearning for God?
Of course. Underlying all of this is that we all do want to connect to God at some point. There is this sort of hole in humanity that exists. There's 2 holes that exist in your soul. One hole that exists in your soul, and when I say it's a hole, it's more like an underlying inbuilt desire that exists in your soul, and that is a desire to connect with your Creator. That's one of the holes. The second hole that most people don't have fulfilled in themselves is a desire to connect to their perfect partner. That's the second major hole that exists in our relationships. And so what we do is we substitute, because there's so much pain associated generally with those 2 particular issues, those 2 particular longings that we have that are inside of our soul, we then substitute relationships for those particular relationships. So for most people, they finish up substituting a relationship with a human in place of God. Now, for many of us, it's substituting our Father for our relationship with God. Many people do that, actually. In other words, their father takes on the role of the authority. They then try to do whatever their father wants. They try to please their father and so forth. If it's not their father, then it's usually a religious organisation of some kind that is meant to be God's representative. They then have a relationship with that religious organisation, which is a part of them trying to work through their issues with their relationship with God.
Is that why we have trouble relating to the female side of God? Because most of these people have been male?
Yes, very much so. And in fact, this is a major problem on the planet as well. The amount of, and by the way, there were times in history when people believed God was female only and not male, by the way. We went through these cycles historically where the female was viewed to be God. And if you talk about God, it was always viewing it as God, our mother, and never a father. And mankind has been through these cycles periodically, where we believe God is the mother, and then there was a rejection of that, and then there was an acceptance of God being the father, and then there was a rejection of that, and then there was acceptance of God being mother, but never like both masculine and feminine at the same time. And as a result of that, there has been periods of time in humanity where women dominated the planet, completely dominated the planet. They were involved in all aspects of politics, all aspects of religion, and men were not allowed to be involved in those things during those times. And then, of course, there was this backlash by men as a result of that unbalance. And then men used their strength and their will to overcome those belief systems. And now we have a male-dominated society. But historically, we've gone through cycles. Yeah, women have dominated, men have dominated, women have dominated, men have dominated, and there's been no equality through these cycles. Yeah. And in fact, if you look at some of the religious artifacts that you can see through archaeology, you can see how much women were revered in historical terms through history, but not so much now. So if you look at all the deities that are involved in religions now, it's only the Hindu religion really, that as a major religion, that believes in feminine deities. The Christian religion, it's all masculine deities. The Muslim religion, all masculine deities. And these are all of these are because of the general swing in the population as to who they accept God to be. Historically, there's many artifacts that archaeologists have found that prove that there were feminine deities in many religions on the planet. And in fact, some different races on the planet had only feminine deities, actually, no masculine deities at all. And these were cycles that the planet went through in terms of their viewpoint of God. So if you add up all of these problems, you can see that the biggest issues we have are with God generally. So when we start talking about relationship with God, everyone's going, yeah, okay, and there's not much of a connection to it, because there are just so many obstacles that we have within us that we've got to get over before we conquer.
Aquí se refiere conexión con el tema, con ello, con el tema de la relación con Dios, no con él, literalmente.
Contemplate having a relationship with God, and the obstacles are like pretty major obstacles. In addition to that, because we believe God is a punishing God, we're not allowed to experience anger with God, is the belief that the most people have in themselves. And so, in fact, most people are petrified of actually expressing anger and rage towards God. And so they never do. They never do actually even get below their addictions with God as a result. Remember, anger is always the result of some addiction. And so therefore, if we have rage with God but they can't even express it and are in complete denial of the rage that we have towards God, then it's going to be very, very difficult for us to ever find the addiction we have with God, what we expect God to do for us as to why we get so angry with God. And because we believe God is a punishing God, it's almost like we feel. There's this feeling which is there's a word for it, and the word escapes me. It's a feeling that many of us have that we're terrified. Superstitious is the feeling, I suppose, would be the best way of describing it, where we have this deep superstition inside of us that maybe God is like that, and there's this underlying feeling in most of society that of superstition, where they're always a bit suspicious of God, and therefore don't sort of see God as a loving God, but somebody who's going to require.
Y aquí creo que ha dicho más bien suspicious y no supersticioso, que es como que tenemos sospechas con respecto a Dios. O sea, no lo vemos, tenemos siempre ahí como la cosita ahí de reojo, por así decirlo, sospechamos. Es que se parecen las palabras, pero es raro porque, claro, es una... Bueno, sigamos.
Something of them at some point, and they've got to just be careful with their life. And it's interesting when you talk to even the most confirmed atheists. There is often underlying feelings of superstition that are in them, that are a part of this history, that is part of mankind's history. And this superstitious nature that we have with God has caused us to do all sorts of very, very damaging things with God. This whole concept that is presented in the Bible, in the Old Testament of the Bible, that the Israelite race were allowed to destroy other races, was all based on superstition about an angry God. And so when another race sacrificed their children to God, the Israelite race condemned that, and they decided that they were going to be God's, if you like, sword of correction for that other race. And the Israelite race, as they proceeded through what they called the Promised Land, they eventually murdered whole races, fathers, mothers, children, everybody, and totally destroyed the race completely through their superstitions that they had with God. And I find it interesting that Christianity, a lot of Christian belief principles are based on that kind of treatment of other people. So when you look at all of the different injuries and emotional feelings that we have with God, it's pretty intense, eh? So, Karen?
So to deal with that injury that we have, that we feel that God is punishing, because I get a bit confused with that. I feel that I go into kind of self-punishment with it. Is it just a matter of really allowing that grief that you feel like you're being punished by God?
Yeah, can I show you how this belief gets established in us quite, as a firm belief, quite young? You see, when we are being brought up by our parents, we learn quite early in our life generally that if we punish ourselves, then we can escape the punishment of others. Does that make sense? So many of us emotionally, what we do is we grow up into this place where we learn, and usually we learn it quite young, where our parents sort of lecture us a bit. You know, we've done something wrong, which is fine. Our parents need to give us some form of correction about something wrong. But instead of just giving us correction that's lovely.
Aquí dice, para que quede muy remarcado, que en el texto no queda remarcado, que efectivamente, claro, los padres necesitan dar algún tipo de corrección si hemos hecho algo mal.
And truth-based, most of the time it's also guilt-based. In other words, the parents trying to make us feel guilty so that we don't do the thing again. And what we learn in that process is that it's actually better to punish ourselves than to receive punishment from another person. It actually feels easier. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it also feels less destructive to our soul, because when we receive punishment from the other person, we have a heap of emotions, including total rejection, feelings of abandonment, and quite a lot of other very, very difficult feelings for a child to address if they were totally open emotionally. So what they learn to do instead is they learn to blame themselves for what went wrong. And so we learn to punish ourselves. But if you think about it, the only reason why we punish ourselves is to avoid the prospect of being punished by others. So emotionally, what we're doing when we're punishing ourselves is we're avoiding the prospect of being punished eventually by God. We're hoping that if we punish ourselves enough, God will actually be easy on us. Does that make sense? Now, if you look at the Christian faiths, for example, that are on the planet at the moment, this is rife in most of these Christian faiths, this whole idea of self-sacrifice, punishment. And even they have parts of different faiths, and there's a part of the Catholic faith faith that is like this as well, where they actually have whips that they whip themselves when they notice they've done something wrong, and that way they demonstrate their repentance towards the God who would otherwise punish them if they hadn't have realised. And there is a very strong group of people in the Catholic religion who still believe in that as a form of repentance with their relationship with God. So, yeah, this whole punishing God situation has caused us then to revert to this self-punishment as well. And so what we end up doing is we end up noticing when we've done something wrong, but we want to punish ourselves for doing that wrong thing. And the reason why we want to punish ourselves is because, the reason why we do is because we feel afraid that somebody else will punish us if we don't punish ourselves. But the problem with that is we never address the underlying causal reason, the actual reason why we did that thing. So for example, let's say you did something, during the day where, you had the opportunity to steal, and then you took the opportunity, and it was just a small thing, but, that was a feeling inside of you. It was just a small thing. And you don't even know why you did it. And you even feel frightened about why you did it, right? Let's say. If you believe in a punishing God, you will have a high likelihood to try and punish yourself about it. You'll feel guilty that you did it. You'll feel bad about yourself. You feel like you can't talk to anybody else about it, because if you do, they'll feel like you're guilty and they'll feel you're bad as well. So you try and hold on to it all inside of yourself, and you dream about it. You have all sorts, for a few days you can't sleep, and all sorts of things happen as a result. Interestingly, though, what doesn't happen in most cases is looking at the reason why. And the reason why we don't go to the reason why is because we're so involved in either punishing ourselves or avoiding a punishing God, or avoiding, other people from thinking that we're bad and all those kind of things, that we never get below that to actually find out the reason why we did it. And then, of course, it doesn't get resolved. And then so months later or years later, we do the same thing. And then that adds to the previous feeling, and then it doesn't get resolved. And can you see how the turmoil inside just builds and builds and builds without ever being resolved? Oh.
And what about when something bad happens, like an accident or something like that, and then the feeling I have is that I'm being punished by God, like that's reflection that I've done something wrong, and it's kind of a punishment from God for not doing something.
Most accidents actually occur out of self-punishment, actually. It's a soul thing that we attract when we desire to punish ourselves. And generally most accidents, even of children, are a result of a desire to self-punish, or a desire for attention in children as well. So quite often in children don't get attention until they don't get a hug until something happens that is wrong, bad, to them. So, they fall over, then they get a hug. But generally, many children, particularly if you think of my age groups, of 50+ age group, if you look at that age group, many times you didn't get a hug at all unless something bad happened. Right? And so, in fact, with myself, most people would consider my mother to be a loving person, but my mother never hugged me in my entire life. So what do? You create accidents, and then you get the hug. Then you get the attention that you feel you're missing. And that is a very common action on the part of a child. But it's also part of self-punishment in the sense of when you feel guilty about something, or you feel angry with things, generally there is this attraction that occurs immediately that causes accidents to occur. And we can talk about, there are a multitude of causes for accidents, of course, but that is a big underlying factor. Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's interesting, we then go down the track of going, oh, God doesn't like me. God's punishing me. as well. I did that wrong, and look at it, like I've got this result. And this just reinforces these beliefs about a cruel God. Does that make sense? Like, and this is the problem on the planet. We keep reinforcing these totally inaccurate beliefs about God. We reinforce them over and over and over again. Yeah. That's a good question.
I don't want to take you off topic, but when you say accidents were...
You just put the mic a bit closer.
When you said that accidents were self-punishment, it's a major part of my condition, accidents from when I was a small child. So I hadn't thought of it as self-punishment.
When you're a small child, it begins with the feelings of your parents. So if your child starts having accidents, it's because of different feelings that they're having from their parents that cause the child to have accidents. Normally a child is very, usually by the time a child is 2 or 3 years of age, and even before then, if a child has been brought up in a very safe and loving environment, the child is very spatially aware. And by the time of age of 7, generally a child is perfectly spatially aware. In other words, they know exactly what they can do with their body and what they can get away with without hurting their body. Most children after that time still having accidents is an indication that there is no spatial awareness inside of them. And if there's no spatial awareness, it's because of something that's happened with regard to the space that their parents want to be involved in. Their life too much, or there's something going on between their relationship with themselves and their parents that causes them to have a lack of spatial awareness. And that is also something we oppose upon God as well. Every time we have these feelings with our parents, we then start to believe our parents, God is like our parents. So this is one reason why people are addicted to rebellion with God as well, is because they feel that God will get too involved in their life and cause too much change. And so they prefer God only be a Sunday morning thing, you know, or if that, or the occasion. You know, I stand on a mountain and look at the view and think, oh, you're a lovely God. You know, that's the occasional worship or feelings that most people would prefer to have with God, rather than having a day-to-day interaction that changes their entire life. And so most of our parents have a deep also resistance to having children daily interacting in their life. And as a result of that, most parents feel quite overwhelmed when they have their children. I don't know how many of you have had children, but if you think back to the very first child you had, for most parents, that was pretty scary, the first child in particular. That's why a lot of times the first child is very, very involved emotionally with their parents, trying to assuage the parents' feelings of that they don't know what they're doing with this first child. And that as a result of that, when the parents have any different emotions towards the child then will either go into a feeling of being rejected, which it then tries to avoid by being self-punishing. And when it becomes self-punishing, it then gets the reward of the cuddle or the reward of the re-establishment of the relationship. And so accidents often occur frequently as a result in a person who hasn't felt very loved in their childhood, except when the accidents have actually occurred.
Just going back to the hugging of the children. So if you hug your children quite a lot, how do you know, because being in error as a parent, you're not doing it from a needy point of view, and you're doing it from pure love?
Well, if you hug your children and the reason why you're hugging them is so that you can feel something yourself, then that is an addiction. If the reason why you're hugging them is so that you can help them feel your love, then that's more pure desire, isn't it? So for many people, and this is a problem on the planet for many of us do have children, and many women have children so that they will be looked after at some point in the future or be loved. There is this concept that's very similar to the animal concept that many people have when they have a pet. and that is this idea that an animal will love you unconditionally, and there's this idea that a child will love you unconditionally. They are addictions. When we are in true state of love with our children, we can love them even if they totally have nothing to do with us. We can still love them, and we can still feel those feelings of love for them rather than feeling resentful. When the child is very small, like yours, we often have feelings of love for them in the sense that we want to care for them because they cannot care for themselves and so forth. But at the same time, we often also have feelings of this lovely feeling we have being able to nurture the child, and that's what we've got to be careful of, because it's that emotion that finishes up developing into an addiction, and we've got to be careful that we don't have these addictions with our children, because the children will then feel bound to us, and we don't want our children to feel bound to us. We are not actually their parent. The true parent of your child is God. So, and all you've done is create two bodies for this child of God. Through the process of intercourse, you've created the spirit body and the material body in conception, and then this child of God incarnated and connected to you as a result. So if most parents had the attitude that this is a child of God that I am caring for, they would probably feel less bound and wanting the child to be less bound to them, and they'd be more interested in helping the child connect to God instead. Now, that doesn't mean the parent wouldn't love the child, because of course the parent would. The whole reason why you have one is because you want to share your love with the child. And the whole reason why God had her children was that she wanted to share her love with her children. So it's the same principle. But God didn't want to get love from her children. God doesn't have an addiction for our love. And whenever we impose the same addiction to our child, we finish up damaging our child. So these are problems, of course, that are all part of the gender-based emotional injuries that we have generally. And unfortunately, it just gets carried down generation to generation to generation. And before you know it, we have so many injuries with God, far more injuries with God than we have with any other being. And as a result of that, when we start talking about God, we start reflecting upon, if we talk about God in a positive sense, it's almost like our ears are turned off. It's like, like in terms of our discussion about God. And then we hear the word soulmate. Was that soulmate that I heard? I've got an ear open now, emotion, yeah, or heard pleasure, sex. Yes, I was talking about that one. And we sort of have this closed viewpoint when we're talking about God. And then when we're talking about other subjects, where there's a degree of openness, at least, present. And this is what we've got to, if we really want to understand the universe and understand everything in it and understand ourselves completely, we need to be sincere about working through our issues with God. And we need to be sincere about where we are about it as well. What we really do feel about God, we need to be sincere about. Many people who are religious, when you talk to them, and I've spoken in my life to millions of people who are religious, many people who are religious believe concepts of God that they never voice in their religion, but they actually feel them quite strongly. And I've had a conversation with my own mother about, she's a member of a religion, and a Christian religion, and I've had discussions with her about God, for example, and what I've found in every discussion is that she actually believes that God is cruel and punishing. One of the reasons why she worships God is because she has this feeling that she wants to connect to God. But on the other hand, she is not open-hearted in her connection with God, because she actually believes that from her perspective, her words, she says there's 50 million children that die every year of starvation on this planet, and God's not doing a thing about it. Now, you ask, if you're honest with yourself and other people, that is an issue that most people have with God. You know, most people have this feeling that, you know, if it was me, if I was God, I'd be doing something about it. Why God's not doing anything about it? What's wrong with God? God mustn't be as loving as I am, is the automatic assumption after that. Right? And so there's a lot of what I would classify as misconceptions and misunderstandings that people have about God that they don't even allow themselves to voice in their day-to-day life. You know? And if you don't voice them, you're never going to face them emotionally. And if you don't face them emotionally, you're never going to be able to have a relationship with God. Because you'll carry them in the relationship. It's a bit like if I believe Mary's going to cheat on me every single day of our life together. Can I have an open and close relationship with Mary? If that's my belief. If I believe Mary's going to be dishonest with me, or Mary's going to be cruel with me, like I'll be constantly, every single day, looking for, can you see? I'll be constantly looking every single day for times when Mary seems to be, she might be heading in that direction. Does that make sense? Yeah. Mary, you want to?
It's a question. So what I feel is, in order to connect.
If you turn around that way and look at me, then Joy will have a bit more joy looking.
Sorry, Joy. In order to connect to God,
yeah.
I'm going to need to be brave enough to grieve these feelings.
Yep.
Many of these feelings are
and also
inside.
Remember that the whole of humanity has them. So you're also going to have to be brave enough to confront the whole of humanity in the process.
Their opposition to me.
Their opposition to you dealing with these feelings.
Yeah. My question is about faith.
Mm-hmm.
So where does faith fall into this equation? Where do I decide to trust a different truth, I suppose, because the emotional truth is that I feel God, I believe these things about God.
Yep.
To some degree, maybe not everything on your list. Where does my faith enter, or my trust?
Yeah, I understand the question. So the big problem we have, of course, is if we have these emotional beliefs about God, then how are we ever going to have a relationship with God? It's a big problem. And then secondly, well, if these are emotions within me already, how do I ever have the faith that these are not true? Because the feeling that I have is all of these things are true. Like, that's the feeling. I have it. Inside of myself, that it is true that God's cruel, it is true that God doesn't care, and it is true that God's wrathful and punishing, and it is true the only person that I can rely on is myself, and it is true, why would I want to connect with a God who's just a cruel, punishing, wrathful person? I'd rather just rebel against that God and do my own thing, you know. And it is true that you know, while I have all these agenda-based emotional beliefs that I'm imposing on God, well, God's not doing anything about that. You know, God's not correcting. God's not showing to the world that God's different than this. You know, and these are all feelings generally that are present in most people. So when all of these feelings are present, what do we do with them? Like, how do we have faith that God is different to that? That's a pretty good question, isn't it? Like, because you're going to have at least some faith that God's different to that before you try to address these emotions. Because if you look at it from a purely pragmatic perspective, when we look at these issues in our day-to-day life, how many times have you been able to truly rely on another individual for your life? Truly. Now, you ask the average person that, how can they, you know, in stressful situations with every single person who's around you, how many people have you actually been able to rely on other than yourself? Now, for many people, they'd have to honestly say zero. And for most people who don't say zero, it's very rare that it's any more than 5 in their entire life. Now, that understandably, from a pragmatic point of view, tends to indicate that I should rely on myself. That's the only person I can rely on to look out for me. Does that make sense? And from a pragmatic perspective, how can I change my mind on that issue? I've got no proof I can rely on anybody else. My whole life seems to be proof in the opposite direction to that. Then we look at this issue of, you know, a God who doesn't care or punishing or whatever, and we ask ourselves questions about what's happening in the world. How many times have you seen something in the course of one day that was totally unfair? What you believe is totally unfair. Now, for most people, they have to answer that yes, pretty much every day of their life they observe something that's totally unfair. Yeah, what they believe is totally unfair. Now, if God created this system of things, that means God is okay with it being unfair. Does it not? So I'm getting a feeling that God's unfair. So what's my pragmatic feeling associated with that is, no, God is unfair. Like, I don't see any proof otherwise, right? So how can I have faith when I don't see any proof otherwise? It's very hard, right? So this is why the average person gives up the whole emotional reflection upon all of these subjects, because it becomes very, very difficult. Then they look at this whole thing of God meeting my addictions. How many times have you, in very, very difficult times of your life, prayed to God for something to occur in a positive direction and it never has? Have all of you experienced that at some point? Most people. Mike, maybe. In the teenage romance, yeah.
Surely in that teenage romance that we talked about yesterday, a lot of people prayed to God that he would come back and love me.
Yeah. So oftentimes we have all of this, these so-called prayers that we have towards God, where we're long for something to happen. Doesn't happen. You think of how many people who are religious, who are involved in war, pray in that way, or who've been involved in the results of war, like, you know, people coming through and raping and pillaging their countryside, their safety. They pray for God to keep them safe, and it doesn't appear like God keeps them safe, and they die, or they get raped, or they get hurt in some way. So when we look at that from a pragmatic perspective, we go, yeah, God's not doing anything there either. So how can I have any faith that God's anything different or even exists if God doesn't do all these things? Like, you exist and you want to do something about it, even if you don't feel like you have the power to do it. And therefore, if God really wanted to do something about it, you feel that God should. But it appears like God either doesn't want to, doesn't care, or doesn't exist as a result of these things occurring, yes? If we're honest with ourselves, that's usually where we go emotionally. And what I'm saying is that, yes, all of those belief systems are all present within us, right? And they're all present within us because of what has happened to us in our life, because of what we believe is the lack of response from God. And as a result of that, it's very, very difficult for us to engage a conversation about what God is really like, because we already have established through what we see happening in the world what God appears to be. And so therefore we accept that. Does that sound pretty negative? Yep, that's good. So the question Mary asked was how can we have some faith that God is different to that? Now, how does faith, the question then becomes, well, how does faith get established? Now, I've given some talk about faith some time ago, and we've talked about faith and how it gets established. It can only get established through some actual event occurring that gives you the faith. Does that make sense? There has to be some proof before faith can develop. But you have to engage the possibility of proof. And what I mean by that is we have to allow for the fact that we might be wrong, and that all of these things that we think and all of these things that have happened to us might have an alternative reason. Does that make sense? So we need to allow for that to be a possibility before we can even begin to hope to have any faith that God is different. We need to allow for the fact that, yes, these bad things happen on the earth, but that doesn't necessarily mean that God is a punishing God or a wrathful God. We need to allow for the fact that there might be an alternative explanation that is reasonable and logical, and therefore an alternative explanation that we can use as a basis for developing a different concept about God. We also then look at ourselves, because this one here in particular is these two here are very much related to how we ourselves feel. And that's very much related to our upbringing. So we also need to bear in mind that everything that's happened to me could potentially have happened to me because of different things that are out of harmony inside of me because of my upbringing. We need to allow for that possibility too. Rather than just going, well, no, everything that's happening to me is bad, that's bad, has to be brought upon me by this punishing, cruel and unloving God who's trying to correct me and I don't understand. So we need to firstly allow, if we're going to develop any faith whatsoever, we need to firstly allow that all of these injuries, and of course we could list more, all of these particular things, issues that we have with God, we may have the wrong concept. We need to allow for the fact that because everything that happens, nobody on this planet seems to know very much about the human body for a start. Isn't that not true? Like doctors, whenever you have an illness of some kind, doctors flounder as to what the underlying cause is. They give you a pill or something to get rid of the effects, but it's very, very hard for them to determine what the underlying cause is. So even with the basic problems of our human body, we flounder when it comes to, or founder, I suppose, flounder is a fish. And we found, is it flounder or founder? Flounder. Yeah. We flounder. Seems so funny. Used to flounder fish when I was young. And we flounder when it comes to actually understanding why it happens. We don't understand. If we don't understand why something happens, then how can we ever understand the underlying, fix the underlying causes? So bearing in mind that it doesn't seem like even very, very educated people on this planet know very much, then we must also then from that assume that when it comes to our analysis of God, we may also be wrong. If our analysis of ourself is often flawed, then how can we expect our analysis of a being that potentially is more powerful than ourselves, how can we expect that to be accurate? Now, if we start with the concept that we may be wrong, then we can start to at least begin the idea or have some faith that there might be a different concept of God that we need to discover. Right? And And the only way to really obtain faith that is certain is to actually engage a process of discovery, to actually decide to engage it without, at this point, firming any belief system about it. So I don't know if you think about your child.
¿Qué tal si lo dejamos justo ahora a la mitad? Estamos vivas.
Hola. Sí. Aquí estoy.
Bueno, pues creo que es un buen punto. Sí. Queda más o menos la mitad.
Bien.
A no ser que, ¿cómo vais de concentración? Porque 1 hora más es muy fuerte.
Claro, por ahí como para mechar un poco y vemos.
Mechar.
Mechar nuestros comentarios y hacerlo un poco más dinámico. No sé. Era como participar de alguna forma.
Sí.
¿Cuánto llevamos? No miré, Iván, perdón.
El vídeo es de 2 horas y hemos visto 1 hora. Lo que pasa es que hemos tardado por la introducción y porque lo voy parando, porque no sé si se lee bien.
No, está re bien.
Más o menos se ha leído, ¿no?
Sí, me parece para una cantidad promedio, quedar en la mitad, sí, me parece bien.
Es que, bueno, hay muchísimas cosas, tremendo.
Sí, eso, en esto, hay muchísimo.
Es
Eso lo quería un poco.
una charla nos va llevando muy lentamente, pero a la vez muy, no sé, muy directo, sobre cosas que las hemos visto, pero aquí está todo junto en el 2012, luego lo ha desplegado, ¿verdad? En el 2016, cómo les hacía ese meticuloso encuentro para que vean la resistencia, venga, invitarnos a sentir la resistencia que tenemos ante cada uno de los ingredientes que salen en estas charlas, ¿no? De años atrás, pero que rápido. Entonces, lo que podemos hacer es hacer un siguiente grabación para que, como este vídeo es tan bonito lo que le ha contado, ¿verdad? Que no sea muy largo, que no asuste a alguien, por si acaso lo ve alguien. Y ahora comentamos, si os parece.
Sí, Anita.
¿Me escuchan?
Te escuchamos muy bajo.
Sí.
Bajísimo. Bueno, lo arreglamos y ahora seguimos. Muchas gracias y ahora seguimos.